WS fam, the nation, my dudes and dudettes. Welcome to a very special edition of the Best Ball Plus, sponsored by 1 Week Season. My guest today, you will know him. You have seen him around the streets. It is my good friend, Tod Burros. We're going to bring him in here momentarily. He is now providing some excellent best ball coverage over at Sharp Football Analysis, and he has been one of the most consistent best ball performers that I have seen around the industry. Best Ball Plus, what are we trying to do here? We built this to basically mirror 90, 30 to 60 minute one-on-one training sessions. We added some proprietary tools, and we are obviously going to dive into the heavy theoretics of the game of best ball. Without further ado, I will bring him in. You know him, my good friend, Tod Burros. What's going on, brother?
Remember, shooters shoot.
That's right, dude. That's right. And you are a shooter, man. I'm super interested in some of the stuff.
It is good to be back with you, my friend. I love the overlay, and the neighborhood seems nice and safe and secure. Very impressive.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it. I missed you, and I'm glad to be talking to you again. What is that? Your hand?
I'm sorry, I didn't put on my badge.
Yeah. As you can see, my background is a nice closet. My kids are having a nice little Lego club right now, so we are hiding away here.
I've started going with the virtual background because people I've heard don't like the mess in the back of my my office. So
you do you, man.
And I feel like I'm a brick, right? You know. So.
So it fits.
I am excited to talk to you about all things best ball, and I appreciate you having me on.
Of course, man. And here in the next, about 3 or 4 weeks, I'm going to hop over and do one on your platform as well. Tell us a little bit. Yeah, tell us a little bit.
You and do me favors.
Oh, very nice.
Yeah,
very cool.
Yeah. I'm excited to have you on.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about kind of what you're doing over at Sharp Football Analysis.
Well, I mean, I am just trying to get the best guests possible and talk as much theory as I can. I feel this week I had Justin Herzig on, who won Best Ball 1. The week before I had Liam Murphy on, who won Best Ball Mania 2. I've had some excellent guests, Hayden Winks. So it's really to kind of systematically go through all the topics that affect people in best ball, right? The different contests, the different pay structures, the best people. I think you were a little late, but one episode I'm kind of excited about. We do a monthly live draft, and one of the guys who works here is someone you're well familiar with, Ray Summerlin, who was at Roto World NBC, and Ray is a fabulous guy. And when I first joined the industry, there were 2 shows you had to watch for DFS. One was Levitan, Al Smizzle, and Peter Jennings, that podcast. I mean, there were other good ones too, including the one that JM was on. But the other one that was really, really popular back in the day was the Rummy and Ray show. I don't know if you remember that.
Yeah.
So we are going to have a Rummy and Ray reunion. And we're going to draft the live Best Ball Mania team together. I think that's going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah, that's very cool. And I like the nostalgia of that, kind of the throwback.
Yeah, I like stuff like that, right? And the goal is ultimately to try and give information that new best ball players can take to make them good at best ball, while at the same time serving the advanced hunger that is out there for best ball. So I write a weekly article. It's not going to be filled with tremendous amount of numbers. There are people who do that a lot better than me. But the articles that I write in general are my theories on how to best ball. I feel that I have an advantage and that, I enjoy sharing it. So each week, last week I put out some sleepers. We've done roster construction. We've done exposure. So each week I try, this week I'm going to probably write tomorrow an article on assumptions and how easy it is to turn an assumption into a bias, a negative bias, right? Like let's say I had an assumption, because I know you wanted to talk about this anyway. Let's say there was an assumption that DeAndre Hopkins was going to stay in Arizona. He was being drafted as if he was. Marquise Brown was being drafted as if he was. Rondale Moore was being drafted as he was. So, I have a lot of all three of those guys because I didn't buy into that assumption. And to me, what I want to try and do is, if the assumption is correct, will it hurt me? And I felt like the ADPs were fair on these guys. If Nuke stayed there, it's the nuclear option. That could be the name of the show, the nuclear option. But I think there was a 30-40% chance he wasn't going to be on the team. So now all those players are values in my portfolio, especially, and I love really loading up on the Rondell is probably my most owned wide receiver. He had some really good efficiency metrics last year that Billy Musio shared with me, and I've also seen his efficiency being very good on Twitter. And he was in the 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th round of drafts. Right now, he looks like he's going to be a starting wide receiver with efficiency. And that's kind of what we're looking for. In best ball, you want players who are blocked by opportunity, but have the talent and the efficiency to make the most of an opportunity if it comes, whether through trade, whether through release, whether through injury. And that's something I'm always assessing. Is this guy giving me a floor where I'm at? And it really is kind of a JM to win thing, right? From my earliest lessons with JM to win, we're looking for guys with floor and ceiling. And I think that translates very well from DFS over to best ball.
Along those same lines, another player that you didn't mention on the Cardinals being James Conner. What's your stance on James Conner with the fact that they have very little depth behind him, with the fact that we can probably expect Kyler Murray not to play more than maybe half of the season? Are they out of it by then? Probably. Are they going to rush him back, knowing that he's coming off a devastating knee injury? What do you make of James Conner primarily being drafted in like the 8th, 9th round sometimes?
Well, I mean, I think the price is fair, but I'm not drafting him.
Okay.
Not much. Nelson Sousa impressed on me a couple years ago that when guys get older and they're not efficient, right? When I look at tape, I don't see a guy who's very good anymore, right?
Yeah.
And what the other thing is that, when Cliff Kingsbury brought the air raid system to the NFL, it had never been out there before. I read the book on that guy, Mummy. I did a lot of research, and the surprising thing about that was running, even though it's a 4-wide system, you would think it's not a good running back system. It's a very good running back system because it creates lanes. They also give the ball, Kingsbury had one of the highest rates for every year he was there of giving the ball to the running back in the red zone. So I really feel like you've got an older, inefficient running back. And okay, so what's the assumption? The assumption we've seen a few different times over the years is, well, there's nobody else there, right? That's the assumption at running back. But we've also talked over and over about how most running backs don't matter. Right. So I don't like drafting inefficient players. I think the opportunity is good, but it's not a good offense. It's not going to be a good offense, most likely. And he's got an injury history. and not the kind of injuries that I don't mind, the major injuries. He's got an injury history of being nicked up and missing time. So I don't know that he can handle the workload that some people are attributing to him. But I also know some smart people on Twitter who are loading up on Connor, but it's just not going to be me. I would rather take a chance on a Damian Harris, a James Cook, Alvin Kamara, guys who I think have a chance to, also have a good floor there with a much higher ceiling in my mind. Could I be wrong? Yes, but I just don't know. If you look at his numbers over the last few years, he's been very touchdown dependent. And so I think that Ingram kid, they said they liked him last year. It's a different management system, but we've seen how inefficient running backs find a way to get him replaced. So I'm not on him. How about you?
Yeah, so I'm probably more towards the other side of that discussion. There is a potential. I mean, there is a world where we see James Conner basically being fed as much as he can possibly handle whenever he's healthy. So I think in the 8th, 9th round, that's a fine upside versus cost profile to invest in. I think I have about 20% through about 200 drafts to this point in the season. And the other side of that coin is I like the Keontae Ingram call, because on rosters, and I think it makes most sense to add to a roster as a 5th or 6th running back where you get that upside as a last round pick, because there's really nothing else there. And he's a 2nd-year player. He didn't really see too much opportunity last season. You mentioned the new regime.
They trusted him enough to release, to let Chase Edmonds go. And they trusted him enough to let, who was the other guy that they had? Eno Benjamin.
Oh, Eno Benjamin.
Yeah.
Didn't they have Darrell Williams as well at some point?
Yeah, they had Darrell Williams, but Ingram saw the field. I will argue, okay, so I get the argument for him. I'm going to throw out one other really important thought as to why I'm fading him. I want guys who are going to, look, if he was the best running back there and there weren't the other, there's running back values right now, especially on Underdog, all the way through the draft, right? Running backs are heavily devalued. So I want guys who I can tell myself a story, again, a JM to win one. I want to tell the story that I have a guy who's going to be hot during the playoff weeks, right? Okay. And I think older running back, if they are out of it, even if he is healthy, they're going to be trying to find answers for next year in the playoff weeks of week 15, 16, 17. So that's another thought that I would throw out, kind of to where I say, I get what you're saying, and you certainly could be right. And maybe it is a bias of mine, but I am not going to invest in an older running back who I don't think is very efficient, especially when I have other good options elsewhere.
My counter to that would be James Conner's contract situation. And if this team is entering they're obviously entering what might be a 5 to 6 year rebuild at this point, based on the roster decisions that were made under Cliff Kingsbury, where they kind of viewed it as a win now type window, right? They failed miserably at winning now. You see the defense kind of falling apart, and now James Conner, he has a potential out in his contract after this season, which would basically only bring along a $3 million dead cap. So if this team knows that they're probably not even going to be competitive the next year or the next 2 years, it could make sense that they basically just ride the wheels off of James Conner and sprinkle in Keontae Ingram, see if he is a potential contributor to this team in the future, because there's really no downside to doing so. They know his injury history, but they know they can just bail on him coming next season. And he signed a 3-year deal with the Cardinals for the 2022 season. And he's scheduled to make $6.2 million base salary this year. That drops, and then with only a $3 million.
What can they save if they cut him?
They can save about 5.5 if they cut him.
So, I mean, they just dropped Nuke. Would it totally shock you if it, somewhere before the season?
Yeah, sorry. They can save $2 million this year. They can save 5.5 next year.
Okay. So, yeah, I think he'll be there. We haven't heard any smoke about him not being here. And again, I get the logic of why people are buying him. It just isn't going to be me. I mean, I mix him in a little bit, in case I'm wrong. I'm going to probably have 600-700 teams this year.
Yeah,
but
hell yeah.
I'm probably going to be 2-3% James Conner.
Okay. What kind of got me onto James Conner, and a lot of it was when he was going in the 9th round, right when this draft cycle opened, was the realization that if that's right, if that assumption is right, like you just talked about, that they're just going to ride the wheels off of James Conner for as long as they can and move on after this season, which I think is a viable potential outcome. He would
They also you mentioned a bad defense. They could also be, 24 points down in the second quarter of a lot of games, and it won't be a great game script. Although he can catch passes. So, I think that, it's possible that he doesn't suck even if they have bad game strips.
Yeah.
If you're right.
Yeah, there's a lot of conjecture and speculation in this, but like if they're going to be bad this season. They have the lowest Vegas implied team win total. But if they are bad and the new regime kind of runs the team kind of similar to what Arthur Smith did in Atlanta, I think there is potential for Conner to give us a best ball profile that is similar to what Najee Harris did over the previous 2 seasons, where it's like the touchdown expectation is lower, but he's a guy who could see 350 touches over a full season. And Najee Harris actually was one of the better running backs for usable weeks over the last 2 seasons. He did not have the spike week potential that we kind of wanted out of a third round running back, which is he was going anywhere between the first to the third rounds over the last 2 seasons. But if we're getting that in the 8th, 9th round, which is kind of lowers our risk in that profile, there's value in that from my eyes, from a usable week perspective. And where I've been mixing Conner in is as like an RB2, where you're getting potential for a stable weekly floor. And then you can kind of take shots on those upside backs after that. So he's a very, very good 0 RB running back target for me to kind of mix in. If all the speculative stances that I've taken in my argument for him come to fruition.
Right now he is going pick 84 on Underdog.
Mm-hmm.
I've got a lot of Deshaun Watson at pick 83. Madison is at 81. Who you could make a similar argument about. Rashad White, who's younger and has more juice, is just a little bit ahead of him. Brandon Cooks is in that range. David Montgomery is a guy I'm taking a lot of. I think the field is analyzing that situation a little wrong. I've been right the last 2 years on my Detroit running backs. I had a lot of Swift and almost no Jamal Williams 2 years ago. Last year I had like 23% Jamal Williams and almost no Swift because I felt the value had switched. And so I like Gibbs. I think Gibbs is a good back, but I really like I don't think they paid him $15 million, Montgomery. And that's a really good offense. So I can tell myself a story week 15, 16, and especially 17, Dallas versus Detroit. So I'm most of the time going to pick other players in that range, but I mean, it's hard to argue any starting running back in the 8th, 9th round is a bad pick. It's just not a pick for me.
Yeah. You mentioned week 17, Dallas and Detroit. And I know one of your recently released articles over on Sharp Football Analysis was regarding week 17. let's talk a little bit. Let's shift gears here and talk about some Week 17 matchups. Whether it's one that you're targeting heavily, whether it's one you think that is a little bit undervalued in the current draft scene. Talk to me a little bit about Week 17.
Well, first of all, last year my theory was ignore Week 15. It's a 1 in 10 shot. You're dealing with a lot of injured teams that get through the regular season, but they're not really a challenge. I did focus on both Week 16 and 17. This year, since it's 1 in 16 to get through Week 15 now, 1 in 16 to get through Week 16, and even over on DraftKings, it's 1,000 teams in Week 17.
Yeah,
I am using throughout the draft Week 17 correlations as a tiebreaker. I am willing to give up some value depending, and this was a question I asked Justin Herzig on my draft, my pod this week, and we sort of agreed. I'm willing to, real early, I'm willing to give up a couple picks for a correlation. Middle of the single digits, I'm willing to go to the end of a tier to get a correlation. After that, I'm willing to go, about a round. And then at the end of the draft, I mean, those guys are also speculative, round 14, 15, 16, 17, and 18. I'm willing to, I want the opportunity that if I get a team in the finals, that it's unique, it's loaded for bear without giving up too much of what it takes to get there in value.
Yeah, because all this kind of discussion, it comes down to expected value. What can we expect based off our roster constructions? There's obviously certain must-haves, like roster construction is a must-have.
I call them guardrails.
Yeah. So there's certain building blocks or foundational aspects of best ball that are must-haves. After that, and those have all been proven through expected value exploration through myself, through Michael Leone over at Establish the Run has done a lot of work in expected value. But once we get beyond the foundational pieces of building a best ball roster and then a best ball portfolio, we're right into the realm of theory because this game is so new. This game has not been solved. We don't know what the optimal
and it's going to be
is.
hard to solve it.
Oh yeah,
because one of the key things that DFS players tell us for years is that it really takes about 4 weeks for the numbers to get good, right? Not that the projections are bad the first couple weeks, but there's so many things we don't know, right? Well, best ball, there's always going to be things we don't know, right? We don't know who's going to get the opportunities. We think we know, but we don't. So I feel like, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I do feel like that's what I love about best ball. Numbers enhance what you do, but good old fashioned kind of problem solving. And that's why I talk about assumptions so much. Everyone is making assumptions, and I think not enough people challenge their own assumptions. And so I am constantly, and the way I learn that is the way most people learn things, by making mistakes. I had 3% Cooper Kupp 2 years ago, right? I made an assumption, guy's been injured a couple years in a row. I didn't account for the fact that he would be healthy and Matt Stafford would lean on the best guy on the team. So I am really trying to challenge my assumptions to be a better player and to put myself in the best position to, quote, get lucky at the end. Because say what you want, there's a lot of luck when you've got three, like last year. I mean, you think about how much Josh Jacobs was a cheat code, but he wasn't a cheat code week 16 and 17. Right. So that's what makes this game so interesting, is that each team that you build, you can tell a story, and that story can really have way different flavors than a DFS lineup can.
You just mentioned in that snippet monologue a lot of things that we have covered over the first basically 4 weeks of this Best Ball Plus product. You covered variance, you covered speculation, you covered a topic that I termed what if leverage, which is basically just leveraging off of the assumptions. Yeah, exactly. So what if the field is wrong about this
Right.
situation? What if
And so
Devontae,
much,
yeah.
I mean, I hate to keep saying JM, JM, GM, but a lot of that practical theory he taught me, right? And deserves the credit for. I mean, these are all things that when I worked at a 1 week season, we talked about all the time, but just in a
100%.
different format.
Yeah. So let's turn our attention back to week 17. Any specific situations that you're looking to leverage on the field that you think that the field is overlooking for week 17 right now?
Well, I think that two things. I think that unlike last year, there really aren't a ton of great games. So there's not like these, huge sleeper games, right? I don't think that, the one that I put out there was Houston and
Tennessee.
and Tennessee, because both of them have the possibility of being really bad defensive teams with and they're both going to be out of it. So there's a very, very good chance that those teams are going to be letting rookies play. So my most owned player, and I keep beating the drum, Tajay Spears is by far my most owned player. I think he is a phenomenal player. I would be drafting him in the 12th, 13th round, but because of this arthritis, again, assumption, right? Well, he's got a knee problem. Okay, he's got a knee problem. How did
I heard he doesn't have a knee.
Well, he has no. Well, put it this way: whatever he has, he didn't have it last year. Whatever he doesn't have, he didn't have last year.
Yeah.
And I don't know how you watch tape of Tajay Spears, and the fact that he got third round draft capital with them knowing he might only play a couple years, to me says a lot. And I think the assumption is that Derrick Henry is going to be the A and Spears maybe will be the third down back. I really feel he has a floor. I think he's 100 to 150 carry guy, third down back, 2-minute guy. And then we've got this huge, what if Derrick Henry breaks down again, at his age, so I think that is a real sneaky game. Now, the other thing I want to say is, and again, this is another JM thing. Every week, you could have a 17-14 game, but one guy on each team can give you a must-have score in that 17-14 game.
Yeah, look at the Raiders last year. It was like either Devontae Adams or Josh Jacobs. They finished in the bottom half of the league in scoring per game.
I think the biggest example is 2 years ago in best ball. The biggest example is 2 years ago in best ball. If you didn't have the Rashad Penny, Amon-Ra, St. Brown correlation
in week 17,
week 17, you weren't winning money, right? Not the big money. And those guys were cheap.
Yeah.
But what were they? They were players who we could tell ourselves a story were very talented. And they were players who, were going late for reasons other than their talent. And, so I am looking to add, I'm looking for younger players for those 3 weeks. Guys who could come out, it could come down to anyone who can come out of nowhere. But we've seen time and again, it's the younger players when given the opportunity who have the talent. The other thing I want to say that I've added to my process, I've been very good at running back tape. And in the past, I would watch 2 games of the rookies. I went back and watched 3 NFL games for each team. And every major college player, I watched at least 4 games of tape, if it was available, to really get a sense. Now, wide receiver, I'm not as good, but I know someone who is. Matt Harmon is. So I got a sub to reception perception. All about trying to take the guessing and make your guessing less, right? And I know that's what you believe in. You believe in doing research to point you in a direction where you're guessing less to try and find a way to solve this thing.
So who are some of your late round sleepers that you've been targeting fairly heavily this season?
Well, I'd have to bring the article back up. My memory isn't what it used to be. But I will tell you that in early best ball, I had a ton of Spears. I had a ton of Roshan Johnson. I had guys. I had a ton of Devin A. Chain. All three well over 20%, and I think Spears and Roshan were close to 40. The rookie running backs who aren't the big names, there's such an opportunity in early best ball. Well, you looked at my article. Who did I like? Hold on. Let me just pull up. I knew you were going to talk about it. Let me look at my current. Well, one is Pierre Strong, a guy that I know you agree with. Pierre Strong was one of my favorite tapes last year. I was over enthusiastic because he came out of such a small school. But Pierre Strong, Ty Chandler of Minnesota is a guy that I've been hitting on. Rondell Moore was a guy I was hitting on.
Malik Davis, I
got Malik Davis in there, who's a guy who could, who has shown some talent and is now one injury away from a big role. So I there's a lot of guys late that I still like. And, the season is broken down into windows, right? There's the early best ball window. And then this is another very good window, because if you really have a sense of the talented players, like I'm convinced, and I could be proven wrong, but I'm convinced once we start getting regular camp reports on Tajay Spears, he's going to fly up draft boards, right? So we've got this 2-month window where if we've done the homework on the players who are talented but are blocked, and the great thing is you don't have to hit on all of them. If you go 15, 20% on a bunch of, 6, 7, 8, 9 guys, you only really need to hit 2 of those guys to be living large. Early best ball, the fact that that almost all my high ownership players in early best ball are now going 6, 7 rounds earlier than than what I drafted them. I mean, that's the goal. That's what we're trying to do. Mike Leone showed that the biggest advantage that you can have is ADP value. But that doesn't mean, I'm drafting player A, is normally going in the 3rd round and he fell to the 4th round. It includes that. But what it's really saying is, who's the, like Isaiah Pacheco, perfect example, a guy that was free last year, 20th round, 18th round, whatever you wanted. And then all of a sudden he was a 10th round guy.
Yeah.
Right. Those are the types of things we're trying to identify now, because the ADP gets much more efficient as information fills in, and information fills in once players get into camp.
Yeah, and that's how I break up my windows that you call them. I break them up into news cycles. So like after the NFL draft, when these contests open, we have the most variance. We have the most amount of uncertainty because we don't have information. Now that like voluntary OTAs are starting to be held, we get a tiny little glimpse of information, and it's mostly speculative. So we're going to start to see ADP movements that are fairly large in magnitude, but there could be a very, very good potential for it to be a vast overreaction. Then we get camps that are going to start opening up in July, and then it's preseason. So we have these different windows that I associate based off of the news cycles that come out throughout the offseason. And I like that you talked about that, because there's a lot of movement that happens in ADP based off those news cycles. You see players getting hyped. You see players getting pushed down draft boards. One of the biggest movers so far early over the past 3.5 weeks was Jerick McKinnon. Did you have early exposure to Jerick?
I did last year with the assumption he would be back with the Chiefs. I didn't this year because he's really getting up there in age.
Yeah.
And he did have a couple weeks you needed to have, but I think they're going to trust Pacheco a lot more this year, right? Last year, and they talked about in camp last year his pass game chops, and CEH is still on the roster. I don't like Jerick McKinnon in the 12th. I wish I had taken more, but I had other targets this year. And remember, this offseason, Jerick McKinnon started in like the 11th, 12th round. When he wasn't signed after free agency, he fell consistently, and now he's back to where he was. So there was a window of about a month and a half where I wish I took more. But you mentioned something else that I want to hit on real quick that's important. Knowing when not to chase the hype guy.
Mm-hmm.
I'm really proud of myself about that in general. CEH a few years ago. And what makes these guys really go is that it's the smart players who drive it up. Like I've seen Nelson Sousa talk about a player, and then everyone's got to have them. And it's not that they're not talented, but I call it the Wile E. Coyote effect. Remember when Wile E. Coyote used to chase the Roadrunner, and he would literally go off the edge of the ground, right? Yeah. And he would keep going, and then he would fall. I think that's what happens with certain things, and you have to learn. And that's the hardest one because they're talented guys, smart people like them. But like I didn't have any Antonio Gibson in the first round a couple years ago. I didn't have CEH when he was in the first, other than a token spot or two. Who's going to be, who was the guy that really jumped up boards recently?
This year?
Yeah.
Jerick went from 18th to now 10th. We had Devon Achane went from 15th, 16th to the 8th round now.
Yeah, I think once he gets into single digits, I'm out on him. Yeah. But Dalvin Cook could end up there. All right. So there's an opposite guy. We're talking about the swings. Dalvin Cook, was not a guy I was interested in much. I took token shares in the 5th and the 6th in case I was wrong. But, if you can get him in the 7th and 8th, what if he ends up in Miami?
What if he stays in Minnesota?
What if he stays in Minnesota? Well, I thought they said that he is going to be a June cut.
A report came out about an hour and a half prior to this podcast that it was the first report that said there is a potential for Dalvin to be staying. And it is basically because he himself has said that he would be open to taking less money to stay in Minnesota.
And I think that's what they wanted all along.
I think so too.
I don't think they wanted to get rid of him, or they would have. Right? Like at a certain point, like we're 2 days away from June 1st. They waited until 2 weeks before June to even leak that he might be cut in June. See, that's the kind of signal that I am pretty interested in. That kind of, like there was a lot of smoke about DeAndre Hopkins not being on the Cardinals.
Yeah.
And I don't think, and then there was a lot of smoke that the problem was he wouldn't renegotiate with them. Well, why would you renegotiate with a team that's going to be terrible when, if you're going to make less money, why not try and go out and see what's out there? And that's the difference between wide receivers and running backs in today's world. Because running back, there's not the money out there, but wide receivers, there is.
Another player with a kind of similar overall profile to Dalvin is Joe Mixon. How are you treating his situation?
I wish I had taken a little more. I'm trying to get up to even weight on him. Okay. Again, there's other guys that I really like in that range. I really like Damien Pierce. Especially in half PPR. I think that, he's a kind of a post-hype sleeper, right? Last year, he went all the way up to the 5th round. on a team that was going to be terrible with a terrible defense. Well, he showed everything you would want him to show. He was right after Nick Chubb, I think 5th or 6th in yards after contact, right? Mm-hmm. Which is what you want from your 2-down bruiser. He passes the eye test. He passes the numbers test. They brought in that guard from Shaq Mason. They took another offensive lineman. They've got C.J. Stroud. They've got more weapons. Damien Pierce is one of my highest owned guys. I had almost none last year because I felt he was Wile E. Coyoteing.
Yeah.
But he was showing that he had value in the 5th, 6th round before he got hurt. Now I can tell myself a story that there's value beyond that because this could be a better offense and a better defense, not playing from behind as much, which is what you need for a 2-down back. And I've heard he's not bad with the ball in his hand. I think Devin Singletary's signing has kind of kept him in a value range. I like Devin Singletary, but I think Pierce is going to be the guy. I think Singletary is going to be the 3rd down guy and the change of pace back.
Along those same lines, and this is kind of staying within that discussion because you are so well versed in identifying running backs. What about these backs that are coming off of a major knee injury? And then like Breece Hall, we have Javonte Williams. And then what about like who's in their 2nd year coming off of a knee injury? J.K. Dobbins. How are you treating those players? Which is interesting because there's data that supports the fact that running backs coming off of an ACL in their 1st year have a up to 30% dip in production. And then they're back to more normal coming off their 2nd year. Yet we have Breece Hall going in the 3rd round. Javonte Williams is sliding into the 8th, 9th. And then J.K. Dobbins is available in 5th or 6th round currently. How are you kind of handling those 3?
Well, I think you have to look at that in the context of almost all running backs are good values, right? Every time I take, like, I laugh when I see people taking Bijan at 1-3, right? I mean, the opportunity cost that you're passing on at wide receiver, and sometimes with Travis Kelce, if you think he's going to have another year like he did last year to separate. I mean, I love Christian McCaffrey, but his numbers were way down with Elijah Mitchell when Elijah Mitchell was there. I feel dirty every time I take a 1st-round running back. I'm mixing in Taylor and Barkley in the 2nd. I like Tony Pollard. I like Breece Hall. So back to your original question.
Mm-hmm.
Again, we have to look deeper, right? We've also found out that single knee tear of the ACL is much more likely to be able to come back and have a decent 1st year, not miss time. Mm-hmm. Someone like Javonte Williams, who's had 3 or 4 different problems with the same knee, that's a guy that I'd rather lose, right? I'm not saying I never take him, but I also, really like Samaje Perine. Because Sean Payton has always fed the heck out of his running backs in the passing game.
Yep.
And
Lombardi.
And Payton talked about how when he was trying to get Perine to come there, his selling point was, have you seen what I've done for running backs with receptions?
Yeah.
Right? To get that guy in so I still take him on underdog, but I started doing DraftKings finally. I like their tournament more this year with the $150 rebate and it being $10. You mean I can max a tournament for $1,500 and maybe win $1 million? Yes, please.
Yeah.
I find myself wanting to take him probably more than's healthy because, what have we always talked about again at 1 week season about, the cheap running backs who have a pass catching role. Mm-hmm. And how valuable they are. Kenny Gainwell is like free right now. Now I could see where why people are passing on him, but what if Swift gets hurt again? 16th, 17th round Kenny Gainwell could be awesome. So
one of my favorite things to do, I'm going to just jump in right there real
yeah,
quick. Kenny Gainwell and Rondale Moore. They're like back. You can go back to back at like 16th, 17th round. And
they
there's
were
your week
both
17
two of
correlation.
my top 5 owned players in early best ball. So
Yeah.
I'll take the L on Gainwell. But yeah.
Don't take it yet. He's only fallen a round
Well,
or two because
from
he's
an
going so
ADP
late.
perspective,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
I'm taking all these victory laps for all the guys that were in the 17th round that are now in the 12th. Gainwell's one that was in the 12th that's now in the 17th.
Yeah. That's an interesting discussion also with the Denver running back room, because I had let's see, I want the exact number. I had 25% Samaje Perine when he was going in the 15th, 16th round. Now he's up the delta in ADP between Javonte Williams and Samaje Perine is closing rapidly. So now that Javonte, his ADP is like 92, but I see him routinely in the low hundreds in ADP. So now that that's the case, I'm starting to sprinkle some Javonte, because I was like you, I had zero Javonte through the first 150 drafts. But now that he's falling and you're getting like triple digit ADP sometimes, or you're able to get exposure to him in the triple digits, I'm okay doing that. And it's kind of this mindset of I was so heavy into Samaje Perine early that now I can basically just kind of take a little bit of a hedge or a balanced approach and get some exposure to Javonte now that he's being drafted in like the 9th round.
Yeah, this gets to, if you want to know somebody who knows what they're talking about, because there's a lot of experts out there talking a lot of stuff. One of the biggest deal breakers for me, as far as respect for an analyst, is when someone says, I won't be drafting any of player X this year,
Yeah.
or I want as much player X as I can have this year. I mean, to me, without ADP, it's like saying, I really like Toyota Siennas, right? And I normally get a used one around, before COVID, like 26, 29,000, when they came back from leases. If all of a sudden those are $50,000, I'm going to have a lot less interest in the Toyota Sienna. And likewise, if there's a minivan that I don't like that normally goes for 20 grand, and all of a sudden I can start getting them at 12 grand, I might have interest all of a sudden. So any discussion without ADP is a ludicrous proposition. And, I think the way you build a portfolio is you constantly should be looking to take those kind of discounts like what you just said, right? Because if he comes into camp and he seems healthy, all of a sudden you're looking at another 6th, 7th round guy.
Yeah.
So, I like that.
Very cool. We kind of hit week 17 stuff. We kind of hit late round sleepers. We talked about this idea of like a dynamic draft strategy and basing it off of the window, that is the word that you used. Are there any other things that you're thinking about dependent on like when you're drafting? And obviously the goal here is closing line
Can I
value
change
versus
when
ADP.
to where?
Yes, please. Yeah, let's talk about that.
All right. So we hear all, that was the perfect question you were asking, because I had meant to add that into my last long-winded answer, and I will incorporate it into this long-winded answer instead.
Perfect. Let's go, baby.
So we hear over and over again about how zero running back has been really tough on Underdog. I think on DraftKings, that strategy is much more viable because, again, right back to that point about the pass catching backs. Now I can build a roster with guys who have pass catching chops who might get me 8 to 10 points a week that will give me the floor so that I can load up at the other positions early. And like I love Elijah Mitchell. There's certain guys, backups in high-powered offenses.
Yeah.
There are so many cheap, because running backs are so cheap. I'll give you another one. Besides zero running back, I threw this out at Justin this week on my pod. On Underdog, I'm willing to do a 2-7-6-3 build. Take 6 wide receivers in the first 10, 11 rounds, and just kind of the opposite of zero running back. And, think about it, because you can, running, it's half PPR, right? You don't need huge weeks from these running backs to get you to where, entry level performance in the flex is from wide receiver. There is a wide receiver dead zone right now. For me, it's right after Elijah Mitchell. Maybe I'll dabble in Sky Moore. There's a couple other guys I might dabble in.
Jamison Williams for me. That's where the cliff just falls off.
I like Elijah goes after him. And I think Elijah, like if you, again, Matt Harmon, I went to Matt Harmon's reception, and he said Elijah was almost as good last year as the year before in all the metrics that matter. He just got into a problem with his coach, and his quarterback couldn't get him the ball.
You're not talking about Elijah Mitchell, the running back.
Elijah Moore, I'm sorry.
Moore, okay.
Elijah Moore is kind of where the drop-off is for me.
Yeah.
I'm adding a ton of him right now.
Are you you said earlier you were targeting Watson fairly heavily. Is that your primary stacking partner?
No, because Amari's not that expensive.
Yeah.
I like DPJ. I like Njoku. I even like Cedric Tillman as a late flyer in case there's injuries there. I mean, again, what's the assumption? The assumption right now in Watson's ADP is that he's never going to be what he was.
Yeah. And
because after missing 2 full years with no practice and no really even like being in the room, all of a sudden he was active, and a week later he was starting. And over 5-6 games, he looked terrible. He's going to have a whole off season. I just don't think quarterback is the kind of position where you just lose your skills.
Yeah.
But I do see where you could be rusty as hell after having 2 years off.
Might take you a half season to get back, right?
Yeah. So I mean, and I like the Cowboys too. Dak has continued to fall. You got cheap stacking partners. And what's the assumption with Dak? That they lost Kellen Moore and Mike McCarthy's going to want to run more. Well, they let Zeke go. They didn't bring in any other running backs. Maybe Lenny ends up there. We know they don't want to give the ball to Pollard more than 18 to 20 touches. I love Dak at his price, and you can stack him with Lamb, Cooper, Ferguson. Gallup is late. Ferguson is late. I think Ferguson's a great pick right now. I don't think that Schoonamaker guy is going to be ready.
Yeah, I absolutely love Fergie as a third tight end. And I really love Fergie on rosters that I have old Jamison Williams. That's, I think, probably going to be the lowest combination of players from that game. And I'm already lower on that game than I think the field is as a week 17 combination. But the fact that the field is likely to not have a ton of that pairing, I love running it as a skinny correlation of those two.
Well, and that goes back to my earlier point. You want to build in these kind of, instead of targeting a game with 5-6 guys, that's a suboptimal game. I like taking 2 guys that I think are talented that have that correlation and hope that you kind of hit the nuts, kind of like Benny and Amon-Ra St. Brown. So I love Jamison Williams on teams where I have 4 running wide receivers already. And I've told you, because there is a wide receiver dead zone, I'm passing on running backs. I'm starting with Damien Pierce a lot, with Montgomery. I'll mix in guys like Aaron Jones, 4th, 5th round guys. Yeah. There's some great people there. and I have plenty of. I think the most important place to take a running back now in a lot of lineups is the early third round. I
Yes.
think that Brees Hall and Ramondre and Josh Jacobs, at least one or maybe two of those guys could. And I don't like the wide receivers in that range value wise.
Yeah, DK Metcalf, and that's kind of a interesting that you brought that up, because that's something I had identified as well.
What do you think of Jackson Smith enigmas?
The enigmatic Jackson JSN. I am probably the most overweight of all wide receivers on Tyler Lockett. I think
I am right there with you, brother.
Yeah, so I take JSN.
The most disrespected fantasy football player of the last 5 years
of all time.
As far as and look, I get DK Metcalf. I think you have to mix him in. This assumption that somehow I am just shocked that JSN is going ahead of Lockett.
Yes,
I mean, I wouldn't draft JSN 2 rounds. I would need a 2-round spread to, I'm not looking at JSN unless it's the 8th, 9th round. I mean, what do you, I mean, I think he's being drafted ahead of his ceiling. And this is another guy who missed pretty much his whole senior season.
Yeah.
So, and Pete Carroll has historically deferred to veterans if the veterans are worth it.
JSN is a guy that I force if it's past ADP, because if I didn't, I would have 0. So he's a guy who I'll force past ADP for the potential for late season spike weeks. That's basically it.
My rule. All right. So this is a Dave Hubbard one I learned from him. The only way they hurt you is if they crush ADP of the other people in that area.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I think, is such a small percentage with JSN. I'm willing to risk it. Right.
I won't argue against that. Yeah.
In other words, he would have to give up first or second round value during those 3 weeks to hurt me. And even then, maybe I have a guy in that range who also does that.
Probably.
I do think you need to take a few shares just in case, because again, I always talk about injury.
Yeah, exactly.
If someone gets hurt, you don't want to have 0.
Yeah.
But he's a guy that I'm not buying now, because what have we seen? We go to camp and the coach speak, and Lockett and Met. You think that JSN's going to be in 2 wide receiver sets in camp over the 2 veterans, and then all of a sudden people are like, "Oh my gosh, maybe this guy's ADP is 5 rounds too high."
Yeah,
and then I will start adding, that's when I'll buy in case I'm wrong.
Yeah. I have a few shares in like the 70 range. But it's something that, like, if I'm like, oh God, I see JSN still on the board after Tyler Lockett and it's in the 70s, I'll take a stab as a force.
I never see him there, but I agree. You should.
Yeah.
And that's the right way to play it. That's the right way to play best ball, with volume.
Thanks, man.
Sure.
Well, dude, that was a lot of fun. I'm glad we could get back together. Before we get out of here, I'm sure listeners, obviously you've been around OWS, but tell us where we can find you. And I look forward to coming on with your show in the next few weeks.
Yeah. And if you ever want to do a live one, I'm always willing to come on and talk with you if you need me. At Best Ball NFL, Sharp Football Analysis. Thanks, you guys at OWS. A lot of you guys have been really great to me, and I appreciate the opportunity to come on. And obviously, I'm pretty passionate about best ball.
That's why I love you, man. I love you. When you are passionate about something, you do it, and you do it well. That's going to do it for us, OWS fam. Again, this was a special edition of the Best Ball Plus, found at 1 week season. You know where to find me. I will see you in the draft lobbies, and we will see you at the top of the leaderboard.